want you to note the objectives as we get started today. Hopefully by the end of these notes, you'll be able to describe to me what parts make up a habitat and what parts make up a niche. So those are two vocab words to be on the lookout for. Then you should be able to explain to me how feeding relationships, so how organisms eating each other, is connected to how energy flows through an ecosystem. And then you should be able to identify different trophic levels. So you'll have to be looking out for what a trophic level is as well. So a few vocabulary words in there that you want to be paying attention to. The place where an organism lives is called its habitat. There's one of those vocabulary words already, right? It's the place where an organism lives. Okay. As you saw in our leaf litter lab, lots of different organisms can live in the same habitat. So a habitat isn't quite like a house, right? In your house, it's probably just your family that lives there, correct? Maybe you have a pet, but otherwise it's usually just your family. You're not going to have a whole bunch of different people living in your house. So while we sometimes use our home as an example of a habitat, it's a little bit different because in nature, one habitat or one place where an organism lives can be occupied by lots of different animals and plants and other organisms. Okay? But how can one habitat support so many organisms? Well, if those organisms have a different role, or what we call a niche, then those organisms are not in competition with each other, and that allows them to survive in that area. An organism's niche, or their role, remember, can include the following things. It can include what they eat. So what food do they get? It can include where they live. So their habitat can be a part of their niche. Okay? It can include how they get their food, right? So several organisms might eat similar foods, but they might get them in different methods, right? And it can include how they go about finding their mate. It can include lots of these different things. So all the parts that go into an organism living its life is part of its niche or its role in that ecosystem. There are a few basic roles that organisms can have in an ecosystem. So every organism has their own very specific niche, okay? So that's the stuff that we just talked about. Part of that niche is the general role that they serve in their ecosystem. And we're going to talk about what those general roles are, okay? The first one is producer, okay? Producers, which are also known as autotrophs, produce and producers are capable of capturing their own energy. If you have a photoautotroph, like a plant, they capture their energy from sunlight. So they take sunlight, which is energy, as we learned, and they change it into a form of energy that they can use, chemical energy. And then we have chemoautotrophs, which capture energy stored in chemical compounds. These guys are not as common here on Earth. They exist in kind of extreme environments like the vents near the floor of the ocean where it's super hot and full of lots of chemicals. There are some types of producers that live down there that use that because at that point, is there a lot of sunlight available to them down there? No, so they've got to find another way. Otherwise, there wouldn't be able to be any life at the bottom of the ocean because there wouldn't be energy available down there. Okay. Producers are pretty important to an ecosystem. Anybody have a guess as to why a producer might be important?
Insects, they process the soil, which can be good.
Yeah, no, I mean, insects do like help move the soil and stuff. We're talking about producers, like plants. Why are plants important to an ecosystem?
They produce air, which we need to breathe.
That's true. They do produce air for us to breathe. That's one reason they're very important.
Food and like in the rainforest, there are several plants there that have which which can be used as medicine.
True. Yeah. And the one that you touched on just briefly, food, is the most important one, I think. Maybe second to the oxygen one. Oxygen's pretty important. But producers are really important to ecosystems because you and I, we can't take sunlight and make energy out of it, can we? As much as I would love to be able to just go take a nap in the sunshine and be full, I can't do that. I can't go out and take that sunlight energy and turn it into energy that my body can use to do its life processes. So if I'm going to get my energy, I've got to get it from something that can do that, or from another organism that eats something that can do that, right? So producers are very important because they are what takes energy, makes it into a usable form, and puts it into the ecosystem. Without them, we don't have a starting level of energy that we can use. The next kind we're going to talk about, the next role that an organism can serve, is a consumer. Consumers are also known as heterotrophs, and they get their energy from eating other organisms. Okay, so you and I fall into the role of consumer. We eat other animals or plants. Okay, so we eat organisms. We either eat producers or we eat consumers that eat producers. There are several different types of consumers. Herbivores are consumers that only eat plants. Carnivores are consumers that only eat animals. And you and I are omnivores, which are consumers that eat plants and animals. There's a final kind that somewhat fits with the carnivore section, but is a little bit different, which is a scavenger. And these are just consumers that eat organisms that are already dead. So think like your turkey vultures, okay? They eat dead animals, so they would fit as a scavenger. They're still technically probably a carnivore, but they also fit into the category of scavenger. And lastly, let's talk about decomposers, okay? These are very specialized consumers, and we talk about them separately because unlike other types of consumers, these guys eat organisms that are dead, but they break those organisms down and they return their materials back into the ecosystem. So a turkey vulture might eat a dead organism, but they're just getting their energy from that organism and getting their nutrients from that organism and moving on. When a decomposer breaks down a dead thing, they get energy from it, but they also put energy and materials back into the ecosystem, which is different from just a scavenger. Okay? These guys are important. Without them, we would be surrounded by dead things, which would be unpleasant. And also, there's a limited amount of some resources, and if those resources don't get recycled back into the environment, then we run out of them. So they're very important because of that. On Earth, here on Earth, bacteria and fungi are the two most common decomposers. Okay, so there's bacteria all around you and inside of you. In fact, you're kind of more bacteria than you are person in terms of number of bacteria cells. And they're everywhere. And then fungi are things like mushrooms that you may see out. So if you've ever seen a rotting log covered in mushrooms, those are decomposing that log back into pieces that will go into the soil to be used again. When organisms live together in close, long-lasting relationships, we call those symbiosis. But there's a couple different types of symbiosis, okay? So these are just relationships that last for a long time where the organisms are in close contact. Okay? The first type is parasitism. In this relationship, one organism is going to benefit and the other organism is going to be harmed. So think fleas on dogs, right? The fleas benefit, the dogs are harmed. Still a very close relationship where they're in contact for a long time, but one is being damaged and one is being helped. The second type would be what we call mutualism. In this relationship, both organisms are going to benefit. So think about the fish that swim around and eat parasites off of sharks, if you've ever seen that, where the sharks come up to the coral reef and then all the fish come out and they eat the parasites off of them. The fish benefit because they're getting food, they're eating the parasites, and the sharks benefit because the parasites are removed from them, so they're no longer being damaged by those parasites. So that is a mutualistic relationship where both of them benefit. And then the third type is just called commensalism. In this relationship, you have one organism that's benefiting, and then the other organism isn't being helped, but it's also not being harmed. So a good example of this is clownfish living inside of sea anemones. Okay, it doesn't damage the sea anemone, but it's also not a benefit to the sea anemone. And it's very helpful to the clownfish because they get protection, right? So one is being helped, and then the other one just kind of couldn't care one way or the other. There's nothing really helpful or harmful about the relationship. Now, we've talked about habitats and niches, and we've talked about the different roles organisms can serve in their ecosystem. So now we're going to talk about how matter and energy can be moved through ecosystems. Okay? We use food chains as models to describe how energy is transferred in ecosystems. So a food chain might look like the following. You might have grass that's being eaten by a grasshopper. That gets eaten by a bird. That gets eaten by a snake. So what they're showing here is that as things get eaten by other things, energy is transferred. So we know that producers, like plants, get their energy from the sun. So they are at the bottom of all food chains. And this is what we would call our first trophic level. So this is the level at the very bottom of all food chains, and it's also, coincidentally, the level with the most energy available, because up until this point, no energy has been used yet, right? They've gotten it from the sun, but all that energy is there and available. So, producers are eaten by consumers who gain some of their energy, okay? There's less energy available at each level of the food chain after that. And those are, when we talk about levels of the food chain, what we're talking about is trophic levels. So we start at the primary trophic level, the first one where it's all producers, it's all autotrophs. And then we have the second trophic level where we have first order consumers. So those are consumers that are eating producers. And then we have the next trophic level where we have second order consumers, where they're eating other organisms that are eating producers. And then finally we have third order consumers that feed on second order consumers, and they make up the fourth trophic level. So when we talk about trophic levels, we're really just talking about organisms that are at the same step or feeding level of a food chain. And it's possible, right, if you have a mouse that might eat seeds, so that would make it a first order consumer and it would be in the second trophic level, but that same mouse might also eat crickets, which would make it a secondary consumer, which would put it in the third trophic level. So it's possible for an organism to be in more than one of those trophic levels. A really nice picture of an ecosystem with trophic levels marked on pages 156 and 157 of your book, if you ever want to go look at it. Some energy from each trophic level is used by the organism for their life processes. Some is lost as heat. Okay? So when you do things, you produce heat, right? Body heat. That's some energy being lost as heat. And then also, not every organism at every trophic level is consumed, right? If you can have a whole field of grass, not every single blade of grass is going to get eaten, right? So not all energy from each trophic level moves on. There's a lot of energy available at that first trophic level, but not all of it gets eaten, and then some of it that does get eaten gets used up or lost as heat. So by the time we go to the next trophic level, there's less and less energy each time. Ecosystems rarely have just one food chain. Sometimes you have multiple connected ones. We call that a food web. Okay, so all of those connections together. All right, that's the end of the notes.